And I wanted to begin by just thinking a bit about what we mean by difficulty in poetry. I think a lot of young people, it's nice to see some young people here this evening, would say that they find poetry much more difficult than the novel. Now, a lot of writers have written about what constitutes poetic difficulty. And I just want to read some quotations. The American writer Joyce Carol Oates sees difficulty as almost part of the definition of good poetry. And she writes, "Prose, it might be speculated, is discourse. Poetry, ellipsis," and the word is from the Greek word ellipsis, which means omission or falling short. So prose is discourse, poetry, ellipsis. Prose is spoken aloud, poetry overheard. The one is presumably articulate and social, a shared language, the voice of communication. The other is private, elusive, teasing, sly, idiosyncratic as the spider's delicate web, a kind of witchcraft. It's rather wonderful. I think whenever poets try to write about poetry, they become highly poetic. Now, of course, the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas said something very similar. "You're back with the mystery of having been moved by words. The best craftsmanship always leaves holes and gaps so that something that is not in the poem can creep, crawl, flash, or thunder in." Now, what both these poets are pointing to about great poetry is this idea of gaps. Carol Oates calls it omissions, ellipsis. Dylan Thomas calls it gaps and holes. And this, I think, accounts for something which a poet that I find particularly difficult, Geoffrey Hill, claims is the great democratic aspect of poetry. Now, you might think that difficult poetry with its gaps and ellipses is going to be elitist. Geoffrey Hill turns this round and says, no, that's what constitutes its democracy. And what he says is, and I quote, "Difficult poetry is the most democratic because you're doing your audience the honor of supposing that they are intelligent human beings. If you write as if you had to placate them or entice their lack of interest, then I think you're making condescending assumptions about people. I mean, people are not fools, but so much of the populist poetry of today treats people as if they were fools." Another obvious difficulty with poetry is the way in which poets use words in ways that invigorate the language. Poets' words always mean something slightly other from what the dictionary might tell us they mean. Elie Kamarov writes, "Poets are soldiers who liberate words from the steadfast possession of definition." And Mallarmé, the great French symbolist poet, said it's the job of poetry to clean up our word-clogged reality by creating silences around things. So we've got Oates' idea of ellipsis, we've got Dylan Thomas's ideas of gaps, and we've got Mallarmé's ideas about silences. Now, how does that really connect with this idea of poetry, difficult poetry, being democratic? Well, I think these gaps and silences and omissions leave a creative space for us as readers of poetry or as listeners to poetry. We're not told what to think by poems. We're given a space in which to some degree, connect our own experience with the poet's words.